At 10:42 a.m. on a freezing morning in February 1941, a British Spitfire dove through a hole in the clouds above Kent, its Merlin engine screaming as the pilot tried to shake off a messes on his tail. At 5,000 feet, the German guns began to flash. The British pilot pushed the stick forward and rolled inverted, forcing the nose down to dive away. Then, without warning, the engine sputtered, coughed, and died. Silence filled the cockpit. The propeller windmilled uselessly. The Spitfire, still in a steep dive, became a glider over enemy territory. The pilot's last transmission was a single word cutout. Moments later, the aircraft hit the ground and exploded. That scene repeated hundreds of times during the first year of the air war over Europe. Young men in the Royal Air Force were being hunted not because they lacked skill or courage, but because their engines failed at the worst possible moment. Every pilot knew the rule of survival: never dive straight down when chased by a Messerschmitt 109. Yet instinct in combat often overrode doctrine. When they tried to escape in a dive, the Merlin engine, one of Britain's proudest creations, betrayed them. The Germans had fuel injection. The Daimler-Benz DB601 in the Messerschmitt could run inverted roll or dive without hesitation. The Merlin relied on a traditional carburetor that flooded with fuel under negative G forces. When the airflow reversed, fuel surged away from the jet and the mixture leaned out. The result? An instant loss of power. What looked like a dogfight between equals was in truth a mechanical mismatch decided by physics. In the spring of 1941, British intelligence calculated that nearly one-third of RAF combat losses during the previous 6 months could be traced to engine failure during dives. The problem was known, documented, and officially unsolved. Engineers at Rolls-Royce had begun working on a pressure carburetor, but the war was moving faster than the paperwork. Pilots were dying while committees met to discuss tolerances. At the Royal Aircraft Establishment in Farnborough, a woman named Beatrice Shilling refused to accept that reality. She was 35 years old with short dark hair, quick eyes, and the kind of mind that translated sound into equations. Officially, she was a technical officer assigned to test the fuel systems of aircraft engines. Unofficially, she was the one person who kept asking why the Merlin failed only in one maneuver. The story of how she changed the air war begins not in a cockpit, but on the cold concrete floor of a laboratory filled with the smell of gasoline. On that morning in February, Shilling stood beside a test stand watching a Merlin engine mounted horizontally. Technicians ran the throttle up to maximum power, then quickly rolled the entire test rig upside down to simulate a dive. Within seconds, the engine coughed and died just as the pilots had described. Shilling leaned closer, eyes fixed on the transparent section of the carburetor line. She saw the fuel surge backward and the air bubble that followed. It was not a mystery. It was fluid dynamics. That night, she wrote in her notebook, "This is not a pilot problem. It's a plumbing problem." In war, the difference between a malfunction and a death sentence is often measured in seconds. For the men flying over France, that delay was fatal. But the person who would fix it was not in uniform, not in command, and not waiting for permission. She worked alone in the corner of a lab, tracing curves on a drafting board under the hum of fluorescent lights, while bombers droned overhead on their way to London. When history remembers wars, it usually lists generals and victories. It forgets the tiny moments when someone ordinary noticed something everyone else ignored. Beatrice Shilling was about to do that. Her idea would cost less than a cup of coffee and save hundreds of lives. The question that drove her was painfully simple. How could a machine that won the Battle of Britain be defeated by gravity itself? If you believe that a single piece of metal can change the course of a war, type the number 7 in the comments. If you think wars are only won by bravery and bullets, press instead. By the winter of 1940, the Merlin engine had become the beating heart of Britain's air defense. It powered the Spitfire and the Hurricane sleek fighters that had turned the tide during the Battle of Britain. To the public, the Merlin was a miracle of British engineering, a symbol of precision and power. But to the pilots who flew it, the engine carried a secret flaw that could kill them faster than enemy bullets. Every pilot knew the symptoms. During a steep negative G maneuver, the engine would cough once, then die. The propeller spun in silence. For 2 or 3 eternal seconds, the aircraft fell like a stone while the pilot pulled at the controls helpless. Those few seconds were enough for a Messerschmitt to close the distance and fire. The cause lay deep inside the SU carburetor, a beautifully simple device designed for peacetime flying, not violent dog fights. At its heart sat a small float chamber that controlled fuel flow using gravity. In level flight, the system worked perfectly. The float maintained a steady mixture of air and fuel to the cylinders. But when the airplane pitched sharply downward, the fuel surged forward and the float jammed. Instead of regulating the mixture, it starved the engine of gasoline. No fuel meant no combustion. No combustion meant no thrust. To the engineers at Rolls-Royce, this was a known limitation. They were already working on a new pressure carburetor that could handle negative G forces, but production lines were full. Materials were scarce, and new designs needed testing and approval that could take months. The Air Ministry marked the problem as under review. Pilots didn't have time to wait for paperwork. The German solution was brutally efficient. The Daimler-Benz DB600 and one engine in the Bf 109 used a direct fuel injection pump. Instead of relying on gravity, it forced fuel into the cylinders under pressure. It didn't care about negative G. The moment a German pilot pushed the stick forward, his engine kept running smoothly. The difference in technology created a lethal imbalance in air combat. A British pilot named John Freeborn once described the feeling in his combat diary. "We dive and lose power. They dive and gain it." He survived 12 missions before being shot down in a dive. His aircraft's Merlin failed just as he tried to roll away. In those seconds of silence, he became another number in the RAF's grim tally of mechanical casualties. Inside the laboratories at Farnborough, the problem was reduced to numbers: fuel pressure, float angles, flow rates. But for the pilots, it was fear. It was the knowledge that in a dive, their magnificent machine became a trap. Flight instructors began warning recruits never to push the nose over too fast, never to follow an enemy into a dive. Tactics manuals were rewritten with those words underlined in red. Still, instincts in battle betrayed them. Under fire, every pilot did the same thing. He pushed the stick forward. Beatrice Shilling watched the reports pile up. Each one carried the same short-note engine cut during negative G. She had seen enough engines to know it wasn't a mystery of chance. It was physics, a design built for the smooth air of civilian aviation, not the chaos of war. To her, the tragedy was preventable. She had been a racing motorcycle engineer before the war, tuning carburetors with a mechanic's intuition. She knew how engines breathed, how fuel moved under stress, and how a few millimeters of brass could make the difference between power and failure. When she read the engineering memos, she noticed a phrase that infuriated her: operating within acceptable limits. Acceptable for whom, she wondered, not for the men dying because of it. The phrase meant compliance, not safety. It was the same bureaucratic comfort that always appeared before disaster. In March 1941, a small group of Rolls-Royce representatives visited Farnborough to discuss test data. They explained politely that the factory could not alter the SU carburetor without a design change order from the Air Ministry. Shilling listened in silence. She understood the logic. Every modification required authorization, but logic didn't keep airplanes in the sky. That night, she stayed late in the test bay, staring at a disassembled carburetor on her workbench. Around her, the building hummed with the distant rhythm of generators. The war sounded far away until a siren howled outside. She looked up, half expecting to see bombers through the windows. Then she looked back down at the brass float bowl and whispered to herself, "It's not complicated. It's just wrong." The next morning, she wrote an internal memo summarizing the issue. Fuel flow interruption under sustained negative acceleration remains critical. Recommend immediate field solution pending redesign. The report disappeared into a folder marked technical observations. No one replied. In the following weeks, RAF squadrons reported 27 more losses with the same cause. Official communiques listed them as combat casualties. Shilling began marking those reports with red ink on her copy of the map. Each mark represented a pilot who had fallen not to enemy fire, but to mechanical neglect. By April, the frustration in Farnborough had turned to quiet defiance. A handful of mechanics had begun experimenting with their own makeshift fixes, restrictor plates, modified floats, but none were reliable. Shilling watched them work, offered advice, and took notes. If headquarters wouldn't act, someone had to. The problem was no longer theoretical. It was moral. Every day the war demanded new sacrifices. Yet the answer sat right there in brass and mathematics. And so, in a small office beneath flickering lamps, a woman with grease-stained fingers began sketching a simple ring with a hole drilled through its center, a circle of metal that would control the surge of fuel when gravity reversed. It was the beginning of the device that pilots would later call Miss Shilling's orifice. If you believe regulations should never come before human life, type the number 7 in the comments. If you think rules must always be obeyed, press like instead. The lab at Farnborough never slept. At night, it pulsed with the low hum of transformers, the hiss of compressed air, and the faint tremor of engines being run to destruction behind concrete blast walls. Beatrice Shilling worked through those nights, her white lab coat strewn with oil and brass dust. A pencil tucked behind her ear, eyes narrowed over a sketch of the Merlin's carburetor system. Every report, every graph, every note she read confirmed what she already knew. The engine was choking on its own design. She wasn't supposed to build anything herself. Official procedure dictated that all modifications be sent through design committees, then approved by the Air Ministry before a single part could be machined. But by early 1941, air combat reports made the choice clear. Paperwork was costing lives. On her bench lay the heart of the problem, the SU carburetor flow chamber. Shilling had disassembled it dozens of times, studying the angles of its passages, the way fuel sloshed when inverted. She'd taken measurements down to the thousandth of an inch. The solution, when it came to her, was insultingly simple. If gravity caused the fuel surge, then limit the surge. A restrictor ring, nothing more. It would fit between the flow chamber and the carburetor body, reducing the aperture through which fuel could flood forward. No moving parts, no electronics, just geometry. She began with a piece of brass tubing, the only material she could scavenge from the maintenance room. Using a hello, she cut a thin ring barely an inch wide, then drilled a single hole through its center 0.055 and across, just large enough to maintain full flow at normal attitudes, but small enough to slow the surge in a dive. When the first prototype dropped from the chuck, she held it up to the light. It glowed gold, fragile, perfect. The next challenge was testing. Officially, she couldn't run experiments without authorization, so she didn't ask. With the help of 2 technicians she trusted, she installed the ring into a test carburetor mounted on a spare Merlin engine in the corner bay. They bolted the engine to the stand-connected fuel lines and pulled the starter. The 12 cylinders roared to life, the floor trembling beneath their feet. "Ready?" One technician shouted over the noise. "Roll it," Shilling replied. The rig rotated 90 degrees to simulate a dive. The pressure gauge dipped, then steadied. The engine never missed a beat. For the first time, the Merlin kept running, inverted. Shilling exhaled and smiled faintly. A fix had been hiding in plain sight. Word of the test spread through the lab like static electricity. Mechanics began stopping by her bench to see the tiny brass ring. Some laughed, some shook their heads, most just stared. It didn't look like a breakthrough. It looked like a washer. But those who understood what it meant also understood the risk she was taking. Unauthorized modifications to military equipment could lead to court-martial, even imprisonment. Her supervisor, a man named Dr. Stone, summoned her the next morning. The conversation was brief. "You performed an unsanctioned experiment," he asked. "I performed a successful one," she replied. "You realize what this means for your position. I realize what it means for our pilots." He sighed, rubbed his forehead, and said nothing more. Regulations were clear, but the results were undeniable. Officially, the experiment would be under review. Unofficially, no one told her to stop. That night, she machined 10 more rings. Each took less than 20 minutes. By dawn, she had a small box filled with golden circles. 10 chances to keep 10 engines alive. Within a week, Shilling and 2 technicians loaded those parts into a Royal Air Force van and drove through the rain to an airfield in Kent. The smell of fuel and grass mixed in the cold air as they pulled up beside a line of Spitfires, their noses strewn with oil and battle grime. Mechanics watched curiously as Shilling climbed onto the wing of one aircraft and opened the cowling. "What's that, miss?" one of them asked, holding the carburetor bolt. "An orifice plate," she said simply. "Try it, and your pilot will thank you." They fitted it to a Merlin, started the engine, and throttled up. The Spitfire's propeller blurred to a silver disc. A pilot climbed in, taxied out, and took off into the gray morning. Everyone watched as he rolled the plane inverted and dove. The roar of the Merlin continued smooth and unbroken. When the aircraft leveled out, the pilot's voice crackled over the radio. "Bloody thing didn't quit." By that afternoon, every mechanic on the field wanted one of those rings. They began calling it Miss Shilling's orifice. Half teasing, half reverent. Shilling didn't mind the joke. She cared that it worked. Within days, she was traveling from base to base, installing her modification in squadrons across southern England. She carried her tools in a small leather case and a notebook full of fuel flow calculations. She refused to delegate the work. If it fails, she told her team, I'll be there to see why. She worked without pay for the overtime, often sleeping in hangars beside the aircraft she just fixed. The sound of engines testing through the night became her lullaby. Each morning, she woke to new reports pilots who'd come back from dives of live aircraft that no longer died in silence. Still, the bureaucracy lagged behind. The Air Ministry hadn't approved or modification. Rolls-Royce hadn't updated its drawings. Officially, the carburetor problem was still under study. But out in the squadrons, the problem had already been solved by a woman who refused to wait for permission. The first batch of 500 rings was produced at Farnborough using scrap metal and spare machining time. The second batch was made by a motorcycle part supplier in Birmingham. By the summer of 1941, almost every Spitfire and Hurricane in active service carried her invention. No medals, no headlines, just a brass ring that cost $2 and saved hundreds of lives. If you believe progress belongs to those who act, not those who wait. Type 7 in the comments. If you think war should never depend on rule breakers, press like instead. The morning of March 5, 1941 was cold and windless. The kind of day that made sound carry for miles. At RAF Gravesend, engineers and mechanics clustered along the edge of the runway, their coats buttoned to the throat, watching the metallic glint of a Spitfire warming its engines. The aircraft trembled against its brakes as the Merlin roared to full power, exhaust flames licking from the stacks. Beatrice Shilling stood among them, a clipboard in one hand, a stopwatch in the other. Her brass ring was installed in that aircraft. If it failed, she would see it fail with her own eyes. The pilot that day was Squadron Leader Tony Martindale, a combat veteran known for pushing airplanes and test pilots to their limits. He leaned out of the cockpit window and shouted over the noise, "Ready for your miracle, Miss Shilling?" She didn't answer. She just nodded once. The canopy slid shut with a metallic snap, and the Spitfire began its takeoff roll. The aircraft lifted smoothly into the pale morning sky, climbing into a wide arc over the airfield before leveling off at 1,000 feet over the radio. Martindale's voice crackled through the static, commencing negative G test. "Watch your gauges." Everyone on the ground fell silent. The Merlin's deep-throaty growl filled the air as the Spitfire rolled, inverted, and pushed into a dive. Normally at this moment, the engine would sputter, cough, and die. Instead, it kept running. Full power. The sound didn't falter. Shilling's stopwatch clicked. 5 seconds, 10, 15. Still running. The men around her looked up, mouths slightly open as the silver shape dove toward the horizon, streaming vapor in its wake. When Martindale leveled out, the Merlin continued to sing smooth as silk. Over the radio came a laugh, sharp, disbelieving. "It bloody well works." Cheers erupted along the runway. Mechanics threw their caps in the air. Even the hardened test officers couldn't help but grin. Shilling said nothing. She only lowered her clipboard and exhaled the tension draining from her shoulders. Months of frustration, arguments, and quiet defiance had finally turned into sound. The uninterrupted roar of an engine that refused to die. The test data confirmed it. With the restrictor plate installed, the Merlin maintained 98% of its rated power during negative G dives. Fuel flow fluctuation dropped from 12 cubic in/s to less than 1. In practical terms, It meant the Spitfire could now chase a Messerschmitt into a dive and fire first. For the first time, gravity was no longer the enemy. 2 days later, Shilling supervised a second round of trials, this time with 5 aircraft. The pilot's men, who had lost friends to engine cutouts, were skeptical at first. One of them, Flight Lieutenant David Goodwin, remarked, "If this thing really works, it's witchcraft." They took off in formation, climbed to altitude, and rolled into synchronized dives. The airfield trembled under the sound of 5 Merlin engines howling in unison. Every engine held power. When they landed, their faces said everything. Goodwin climbed down, pulled off his gloves, and shook Shilling's hand. "You just gave us back the sky," he said simply. Within a week, copies of her design sketch were circulating through RAF maintenance offices. Field mechanics began machining their own plates using whatever materials they could find. Brass, copper, even aluminum from scrap propellers. Each one was slightly different, but all worked the same way. Pilots began requesting them by name. The official title was Restrictor Fuel Flow SU Carburetor Type RA. Nobody called it that. To everyone who flew or fixed airplanes, it was Miss Shilling's orifice. The name started as a joke passed between squadrons in smoky mess halls, but it stuck out of affection, not mockery. It was a reminder that the war was being fought not just by the men in the air, but by the minds on the ground. In those months, Shilling became a legend, a quiet one. She didn't appear in newspapers, but pilots told stories about her in briefing rooms and bars. The woman who drove around England in a van full of miracle parts, who refused to wait for approval while their friends were dying. By May, she had personally installed her device on over 1,000 aircraft. She traveled with a small toolkit and a supply of restrictors, arriving at bases unannounced, sleeves rolled up, ready to work. Pilots would watch her crawl under the cowling hands, black with grease, adjusting the same machines that carried their lives. One squadron commander tried to thank her with champagne. She declined and asked for more fuel pressure data instead. Official lagged behind. The Air Ministry finally acknowledged the modification in a memo titled Field Implementation of Interim Fuel Restrictor Device. The note, written in detached, bureaucratic language, never mentioned her name. It simply stated performance improvement observed. Distribution to continue until pressure carburetor available. But the pilots knew whose hands had saved them. Over the next 6 months, combat reports from fighter command began to change. The phrase "engine cut during dive" vanished from the logs. Kill ratios shifted in favor of the RAF. Messerschmitts that once escaped by rolling inverted now found Spitfires on their tails. The difference was measured in seconds. The seconds that Beatrice Shilling had given them back. In one after-action report from 1942, a pilot described a dive over the channel. Enemy dove vertically. I followed. Engine maintained full boost. Closed from 500 to 100 yards and fired. Enemy aircraft destroyed. It was the first confirmed kill credited indirectly to her invention. She never knew the pilot's name. At Farnborough, new technicians arriving at the lab were told, half in jest, "If you see a woman with a wrench and a notebook, make room. She outranks gravity." Shilling ignored the attention. She kept tuning, testing, and improving the device, not because she sought recognition, but because she believed machines should never fail their pilots. That belief carried through every night she worked by the glow of instrument panels, through the noise of engines on the test stands, through the silent satisfaction of knowing that somewhere above her thousands of men were alive, because their engines still roared when they should have died. If you think courage belongs only to those in the cockpit, type the number 7 in the comments. If you believe the greatest acts of bravery sometimes happen behind a workbench press, like instead. By late 1942, the world's largest experiment in mass production was underway, not in Detroit's automobile plants, but in its aircraft factories. The United States had entered the war, and the arsenal of democracy was roaring to life. Assembly lines once devoted to Buicks and Fords now build bombers, fighters, and engines by the tens of thousands. Among those engines once stood above all others, the Rolls-Royce Merlin, reborn as an American product. Across the Atlantic, in a brick building on East Grand Boulevard, the Packard Motor Car Company had been selected to license build the British design. Engineers from Rolls-Royce arrived in winter coats, clutching blueprints that had crossed the ocean under the military escort. They unpacked crates marked confidential Merlin fur and began explaining the intricacies of British craftsmanship to a workforce used to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. "Every Merlin is hand-built," one British engineer warned. The Packard supervisor simply smiled. "Not for long," he said. Within months, Packard transformed the Merlin from an artisan's masterpiece into an industrial miracle. Machinists retooled their lathes. Women on the line learned to rivet crankcases and polish valve seats, and conveyor belts moved engines at a pace no one in Coventry could have imagined. The first production model, designated the Packard V. 1651, rolled off the line in August 1941. It produced the same 1280 horsepower as its British cousin, but with tighter tolerances and interchangeable parts. Every bolt, every bearing, every carburetor could be swapped between engines without adjustment, a concept unheard of in wartime Britain. And inside that carburetor sat a legacy, the tiny brass restrictor that Beatrice Shilling had designed the previous year. Her fix, originally machined by hand in a lab at Farnborough, had now become part of the engineering drawings supplied to Packard. The Americans didn't call it Miss Shilling's orifice. They listed it as restrictor plate carburetor type SU standard fitment. It was no longer a field modification. It was a specification. In those early months, Packard produced fewer than 10 Merlin a week. By mid-1943, the number had risen to over 400 per month. The plant employed 1,200 workers, half of them women, turning raw aluminum and steel into the heartbeat of the Allied Air Force. Each finished engine was test run for 30 minutes, then sealed in a wooden crate bound for factories in California or Texas, where it would be installed in a new kind of aircraft, the P-51 Mustang. Before the Merlin, the Mustang had been a promising but flawed design. Its Allison engine performed well at low altitude but gasped for air above 1,500 feet. With the Merlin installed, the transformation was instantaneous. The P-51B could climb higher, fly faster, and range farther than any fighter in the world. Its service ceiling jumped from 2,500 to nearly 4,000 feet. Its range expanded to more than 2,000 kilometers, enough to escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back. For the pilots of the 8th Air Force, that range meant survival. Before the Merlin Mustang arrived, bomber losses over Germany averaged 30% on deep penetration missions. By late 1944, with Mustangs overhead, losses fell below 5%. The skies that had once belonged to the Luftwaffe now belonged to the Allies. And buried inside every Merlin that powered those Mustangs was the small ring that kept its fuel steady under any maneuver. The philosophy behind that success was purely American scale repetition and relentless precision. In Britain, each Merlin had taken 2 400 man-hours to build. In Detroit, the same engine took 1 200. Packard installed air gauges at every station, color-coded checklists, and a rotating inspection crew that measured valve clearances with feeler gauges stamped. Confidence is not a measurement. By 1944, total output had reached more than 5,500 engines. Each one identical, each one bearing a stamped serial number that traced its lineage back to the drawings from Farnborough. The British engineers, who had once doubted mass production, were astonished. "They make them like toasters," one was heard to say, but the result spoke louder than pride. A single Packard plant could produce more Merlin in 1 month than Rolls-Royce could in half a year. That sheer quantity didn't just fill the skies. It redefined what industrial warfare meant. At the center of this transformation was an idea that started with a woman working alone at a bench, driven by the conviction that machines should never fail the people who rely on them. Her design was no longer just a solution to a carburetor problem. It had become a principle of engineering. Fix the weakness. Standardize the fix. Build it by the thousands. In August 1943, a Packard supervisor named George Thorpe wrote to the Air Ministry, "We are installing the British restrictor modification on all carburetors. Engine performance in negative acceleration tests shows no power loss." It was the first time the American manufacturer officially credited a foreign field innovation. Shilling never saw the letter, but it was her triumph nonetheless. The ripple effect reached beyond the Mustang. The same principle of fuel restriction was later adapted to the Merlin-powered Mosquito Lancaster and even the American P-40F. Everywhere the Merlin flew, the problem that once doomed pilots had vanished. The number of recorded engine cut incidents across the Allied air forces dropped to nearly zero by the end of 1943. Factories were running around the clock. The night shifts glowed with furnace-like casting silhouettes of women welding crankcases and men guiding cranes loaded with cylinders. Radio loudspeakers blasted swing music over the clang of metal. Every 8 minutes, another Merlin roared to life on the test stand, belching smoke and flame before being shipped off to war. It was no longer just an engine. It was an industrial heartbeat synchronized across 2 continents. When Packard engineers visited Farnborough after the war, they brought one of their engines as a gift. It bore a small brass plate that read, "This Merlin is built to the design that would not fail." In the crowd, someone asked if the British still used that little ring in the carburetor. A gray-haired technician smiled. "Of course," he said. "It's part of the family now." The difference between the RAF of 1940 and the Allied Air Armada of 1944 was more than strategy. It was a story of scale, a reminder that even the smallest innovation can only change the world when someone else decides to build it by the thousand. If you believe that true strength lies not in invention alone, but in the courage to build better and faster, type the number 7 in the comments. If you think genius ends where the assembly line begins, press like instead. By the spring of 1944, the sound of the Merlin had become the soundtrack of Allied air power. Over the gray skies of northern France, over the cloud banks of the North Sea, and across the smoking ruins of German industrial cities, that high, steady roar announced a shift in the balance of the war. The Merlin-powered P-51 Mustang had transformed air combat. What had once been a desperate contest for survival was now a demonstration of overwhelming control. Every pilot in the 8th Air Force knew the numbers. In early 1943, bomber missions to Germany were effectively one-way trips. The losses were staggering on the Schweinfurt-Regensburg raid alone. 60 of 376 B-17 wars never returned without long-range escort fighters. Formations were slaughtered by swarms of Luftwaffe interceptors, but by the summer of 1944, with P-51s accompanying the bombers from England to Berlin and back, the statistics inverted. Average bomber losses fell from 30% to under 5 Luftwaffe fighter strength. Once more than 1,700 aircraft dropped to fewer than 400 within months. To the public, this victory belonged to the pilots and their machines. To historians, it belonged equally to engineering thousands of small, precise improvements that made those machines reliable at the edge of performance. One of those improvements had begun as a circle of brass no bigger than a coin installed by a woman who refused to wait for permission. Beatrice Shilling's restrictor plate never appeared in the headlines. It didn't carry a glamorous name or a medal citation, but it changed the way every Merlin engine behaved in combat. Pilots could now roll dive and pull G-forces without fear of sudden silence. In a fight measured in seconds, that reliability became an advantage greater than armor or ammunition. Strategists at the Allied Air Ministry noticed the trend. After the Merlin modification was standardized, mission planners began probing more aggressive tactics. Dive attacks, once considered suicidal for carbureted aircraft, became standard practice. The Mustang's ability to follow a diving fall of Wolf 190 to the deck and stay on its tail shattered the Luftwaffe's long-held defensive edge. Over time, German pilots simply stopped trying to escape downward. They climbed instead, and there too, the Merlin's altitude performance sealed their fate. In a post-war interview, Colonel John C. Meyer, commander of the 352nd Fighter Group, summarized it bluntly. "The Merlin gave us the legs, but that carburetor fix gave us the confidence. You don't fight well when you're waiting for your engine to quit." Confidence spread through the ranks like oxygen. Pilots who once nursed their throttles now trusted their engines completely. Mechanics knew the secret and shared it quietly, pointing at the small brass plate during inspections, calling it our lucky charm. Nobody in the chain of command issued a formal commendation, but everyone on the ground understood its value. The effect rippled far beyond the cockpit. As the Luftwaffe collapsed, Allied bombers could fly in daylight, targeting railways, oil refineries, and supply lines with unprecedented precision. The D-Day invasion succeeded in part because the skies over Normandy were cleared of enemy fighters. Each success was built upon thousands of flights that ended safely, not because of luck, but because the machines worked exactly as they should. Shilling followed these developments from her laboratory in Farnborough. Her name never appeared in official reports, but she received field letters from mechanics and pilots who had heard about the woman who fixed the Merlin. One came from a squadron leader stationed in Italy. "We rolled inverted over the Adriatic, and the engine sang all the way down. I thought you'd like to know." She pinned a note to her office wall. By war's end, more than 150,000 Merlin engines had been built on both sides of the Atlantic. Each one carried a version of her restrictor design. The improvement was later integrated permanently into the Bendix-Strawbird pressure carburetor, which became standard on post-war aircraft. Official technical documents listed the modification as Origin RA Recommendation 1941. Nothing more. the name Beatrice Shilling appeared nowhere. Recognition came slowly. After the war, she was awarded the Order of the British Empire for services to aircraft engineering. The citation made no mention of the carburetor fix or the hundreds of pilots who owed their lives to it. She didn't seem to care. When asked about the award, she said only engines should run. That's all. Yet her work had done more than keep engines running. It had altered the rhythm of the war itself. Every time a Mustang chased an enemy through a diving roll and climbed down again, it echoed the decision she made alone in a quiet laboratory to break the rules and solve the problem. In 1945, as Germany surrendered and the skies fell silent, one could stand on the empty runways of England and still imagine the sound of those engines. The sound of thousands of Merlin, each one carrying within it the invisible imprint of her hands. If you believe that history remembers too few of the people who made its victories possible, type the number 7 in the comments. If you think heroism belongs only to those who fought press-like instead. The war ended quietly for Beatrice Shilling. No parades, no medals, no ceremonies. While London filled with the noise of victory, she spent V-Day in the same laboratory at Farnborough where her story had begun, finishing a report on engine supercharger performance. Outside, people were dancing in the streets. Inside, she kept her goggles pushed up in her hair and her sleeves rolled past her elbows, a cigarette burning beside the drafting board. The sound she trusted most wasn't music or applause. It was the steady hum of an engine that refused to quit. In the years that followed, Britain dismantled its war machine piece by piece. Airfields fell, silent hangars emptied, and the smell of hot oil faded from the countryside. Shilling stayed at the Royal Aircraft Establishment, now working on jet engine fuel flow systems. The carburetors that had once consumed her life were relics of an earlier age, replaced by turbines and nozzles that obeyed a new science. Yet she carried the same philosophy into every design. Find the weak link and make it strong enough to survive anything. Her colleagues remembered her as exacting and unflappable. She rode to work on her racing motorcycle, a bright red Norton, tearing through the morning fog at 9 a.m. an hour. In meetings dominated by men, she was the one voice that never wavered. When an engineer once dismissed her suggestion with, "That's not the standard procedure," she replied, "Standard procedure kills innovation. We can do better." Those who worked under her said she had the rare ability to translate complex mathematics into practical sense, a mind balanced perfectly between numbers and intuition. Despite her achievements, the story of her wartime invention faded into obscurity. The official histories of the Merlin engine credited Rolls-Royce for design excellence, Packard for industrial scale, and the RAF for courage. No mention of the brass ring or the woman who had built it in secret. It was as if her contribution had been too small to matter or too inconvenient to fit into the legend of male engineers and fighter aces. She never protested. "I didn't do it for recognition," she told a colleague years later. "I did it because it needed doing." In 1960, she retired from government service. Her notebooks full of sketches and flowcharts that spanned 3 decades of aviation history. When she left Farnborough for the last time, she handed her personal tools, a micrometer, a slide rule, and a small lathe to a junior engineer with the words, "Never wait for permission to fix a problem." Then she and her husband George, also an engineer, returned to their cottage in Surrey, where she built engines for racing motorcycles in her garage. Even in her 60s, she could still be found tuning carburetors with her hands blackened by fuel, a smile hidden behind the smoke of her cigarette. For decades, her name remained a footnote in scattered archives. Then, in the early 1990s, a young aviation historian named Paul Whitworth stumbled upon a reference in an RE maintenance log field installation of B Shilling restrictor plate successful. Intrigued, he tracked down surviving test reports and letters from pilots who had flown with the modification. The deeper he dug, the clearer the story became. A single engineer acting outside official channels had corrected a flaw that saved hundreds of lives and reshaped aerial warfare. When Whitworth finally located her surviving papers, he realized the scope of what she had done. Using statistical data from fighter command and production records from Packard, he estimated that more than 140 Allied aircraft had flown with her restrictor. The improvement reduced mechanical failure rates by 18% across all Merlin variants. It may be the smallest part to ever alter the outcome of a global war, he wrote in his book, Engines of Victory. By then Shilling had already passed away. She died in 1990 at the age of 81, quietly as she had lived. Her obituary in the Times devoted 2 sentences to her wartime contribution. It did not mention the laughter of the mechanics, who first called her invention Miss Shilling's orifice, or the roar of the Spitfires that no longer stalled when they dove into battle. But somewhere in an Air Museum display case, a single brass ring was mounted beneath a caption, "Carburetor Restrictor Plate, designed by Dr. Beatrice Tilly Shilling, 1941. Visitors passed by without noticing it, just another piece of metal among propellers and pistons. Yet for those who knew that ring represented something larger than engineering, it was defiance cast in brass. It was proof that a line on a drawing board could outlive the empires that built it. Today, the name Beatrice Shilling appears in textbooks on aeronautical design, in documentaries about the Battle of Britain, and in museums where her photographed goggles around her neck sleeves rolled up finally hangs beside the machines she helped perfect. Students studying mechanical engineering learn her equation for fuel flow under acceleration still referenced in modern design manuals. But the lesson she left behind wasn't mathematical. It was moral. Innovation, she once said, is an act of courage disguised as curiosity. She proved that sometimes the greatest heroism doesn't come from flying higher or shooting faster, but from refusing to accept that good enough is ever good enough. When history lists its heroes, it rarely includes the ones who held a wrench instead of a weapon. Yet, without them, the stories of courage in the sky would have ended in silence. If you believe those quiet innovators deserve to be remembered, type the number 7 in the comments. If you think stories like this should never fade again, press like and subscribe, because there are hundreds more waiting to be rediscovered.